Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support is greatly appreciated. Kindly like and share this audiobook to extend its reach, enabling more individuals to access its profound wisdom. Remember to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can propagate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, nurturing a community focused on enlightenment and inner serenity. We thank you for being a part of our mission to make these transformative teachings accessible to all. Let's commence today's reading. Strength for Stillness. April 30, 2012. It's a great night to meditate. There's a gentle drizzle coming down. Looking out, all you can see is the fog of the drizzle. Everything turns your attention back inside. So what have you got here? You've got the breath coming in and going out. And a mind that may or may not want to settle down. Or a mind whose various committee members may or may not be in agreement about settling down. So try and ND the members that want to stay with the breath, that want to look inside, and strengthen them. How do you strengthen them? First, through conviction, the conviction that this is a good thing to do, this practice we're doing here. Something taught by people of no dilemma. People who have found true happiness, people who have no ulterior motive in teaching this to anyone else. They'd found that this method worked. They'd tested it inside and passed it on to others, who have passed it on to us. And so now we have the opportunity to practice. Then there's the strength of persistence, which is a matter of coming back, figuring out how much energy you have to put into this right now, the kind of energy you can sustain. It takes a little while to get the right balance. The image the Buddha gives is the tuning of a lute. You try to tune the strings so that they're not too taut, not too loose, so that they give just the right sound. This is a skill that comes more and more with practice. Then there's the strength of mindfulness. You try to remember. This is really what you want to do. Remember all the various reasons you have for wanting to be here. And those reasons point you to what's happening with the breath right now. If you're going to see anything about the mind, you've got to see it here in the present moment. So you want to look carefully, you want to look skillfully, so as to get results. The practice of mindfulness involves bringing three qualities to your practice: ardency, alertness, and mindfulness. Ardency is the quality of wanting to do it well. It's the element of will in the practice. Alertness is the attention you're paying to see what you're doing in the present moment, seeing what's actually going on. Is the breath coming in? Is it going out? How is it going in? How is it going out? Does it feel good? If it doesn't feel good, then you can bring in some more ardency to pay careful attention to what you're doing here. You can experiment and see what's working, what's not working. Mindfulness is what reminds you as to why you're here, reminds you of what you've done in the past that's worked. What hasn't worked, to get the mind to settle down. You want to bring that to bear as well. You see these three qualities in all kinds of activities. Years back I was reading a piece by Cicero. He was talking about how the mind has three functions: will, attention, and memory. These functions correspond to ardency, alertness, and mindfulness. Of course, Cicero had a direct use for these faculties. He was a lawyer who wanted to win people over to his side. He gave speeches trying to influence people's opinions, so he wanted to draw on their memory, he wanted to capture their attention, so that they would get their will in alignment with his. Basically, this is how you look at the mind when you're trying to persuade it. You have to speak in a way that captures your audience's attention. If you want them on your side, you've got to draw on their memories, things they're fond of, things they believe in, things they hold dear, or fears that you have in common, to get them to focus their will on the direction you want them to go. So in this way, when you're trying to get the committee of the mind to settle down, you're acting like a lawyer. Try to remind the various members of what's good in life, why the practice is something you really want to develop. You have to catch their attention to remind them, to get them in line with your will, which is to do this well. A few years back, I was reading an interview of a famous pianist from Austria. He was giving a farewell concert tour here in the States. And in the interview he talked about what it was like to play the piano, what functions were going on in the mind. As it turned out, they were the same 3 functions. He was trying to listen carefully to what he was playing as he was playing it. That's alertness. At the same time, he had to remember what he had in mind when he sat down to play the piece. He had to remember what the piece was, and also how he'd been playing it up to that point. That's mindfulness. That was so that the present note would tee in with what he had been playing up to that time. Then the next question is, how to play the next note. How do you want this note to lead into the next note? Do you want to go along with your original intention? Or have you found something better? Is the way you're playing moving in an interesting new direction that you want to explore? Or do you want to keep things in line with the original intention? And whatever your decision, how do you carry it out? This is a function of ardency. This is how the mind functions when you're playing the piano well, and it's all a matter of mindfulness, alertness, and ardency. The same 3 functions that we're developing right here. So as you're settling down, think of yourself as being like a lawyer, trying to convince yourself to stay here, remembering your reasons for staying here. Get everybody on board. When the mind nearly does stay with the breath and it seems like it's settling down, then you're more like a musician. There's less need to persuade the mind to actually stay here. The use of your memory and your will gets a lot more attuned. Just remembering enough to keep the mind with the breath and willing it just enough to keep it pointed in the right direction. You're getting a higher use out of these 3 functions of mind, and this way you strengthen your practice again. This brings you to the strength of concentration. Mindfulness is not a state of mind free of agendas. It has a very strong agenda. You want to move the mind to stillness because you realize that this is an essential part of the path. The function of mindfulness is to remember that, so you don't forget where you are, and you don't forget your purpose for being here. You don't forget how to stay here. So you evaluate how things are going and make adjustments as is necessary. That helps you to settle down. The mind can then move in with the breath, get a sense of unification with it, getting into strong states of concentration. That really strengthens your practice and strengthens your sense of well-being right now. Then there's the strength of discernment. As you watch what you're doing and you notice what's skillful and unskillful, that use of evaluation and concentration actually becomes an important part of discernment. It's how the 2 qualities go together. Ajahn Suwat would often speak of this. He'd say, make it your signal in your mind, something that you keep focusing on. Where is the disturbance? Where is there stress? That's something that needs to be looked into. That's where you're going to ND. Ignorance. Where is there anything in the mind that's disturbing your peace? That's the problem. The peace itself is what you rely on so that you can see things clearly. You need the strength to see them clearly, the strength to want to look at them. If you're not feeling well nourished by the breath, if your good committee members are feeling weak, you're not going to be willing to look into the mind's problems. You're a lot more likely to want to place the blame on things outside. The mind claims that the reason it's not at peace is because of this or that disturbance from somebody else, something else outside. But as you develop a sense of well-being inside, you see more and more that the real issue is not so much what's happening outside, it's what's happening inside. It's not that you're placing blame inside. You're simply pointing out that this is where your opportunity for solving the problem is. The other day someone was asking why it is that we keep focusing on the problems inside. Aren't there problems outside? Of course there are problems outside, but the reason why your mind is weighed down is because of the problems inside. And those are problems you can do something about. If you haven't straightened out the problems inside, you probably have a pretty messy idea of how to straighten out things outside. Sometimes, in your efforts to straighten out outside things, you make them worse. So you want to be confident that you're coming from a good place. A place of strength, a position of strength, a position of well-being. That's why we look inside to see where there's stress and what can be done about it. Then all the good parts of the mind become strong. Your conviction, your persistence, mindfulness, concentration, discernment. Keep focusing them inside here. As I said, the weather is helping us tonight. The drizzle outside is like a blanket. It gives you a sense of security and allows you to focus all your attention inside. A clear agenda. February 14, 2012. If you read Ajahn Lee's autobiography, one of the things you notice is the extent to which he would make vows. He'd sit and meditate and have a purpose. A problem he wanted to have clarified, or a question for which he wanted an answer. He would pose it in his mind. I want to sit here until I get this cleared up. Then he'd drop the question and go into concentration. As his practice developed, the questions he would ask himself and things he wanted to know would get more and more reneged. So you might end it a useful practice as you meditate to ask yourself, what am I here for? There's got to be a purpose to what you're doing. Sometimes we hear that meditation is all about having no agendas and not trying to change anything at all. But I've never seen the Buddha describe it that way. You've got to have a purpose. Think about the Four Noble Truths. They're truths with a purpose. To help you end suffering. Where in the Four Noble Truths is your purpose today? When you see the Buddha's definition of ignorance, it doesn't mean having preconceived notions. It doesn't mean trying to change things. Ignorance means not seeing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. For most of us, that definition of ignorance describes the normal state of our mind. We're thinking about other issues, other problems, usually based around our sense of who we are and what we need to keep who we are going. Or around the people, the relationships we love, to keep them going as well. Those kinds of issues, those kinds of questions, the Buddha said, are ignorance from the point of view of trying to put an end to suffering. So even though you may have responsibilities in the world, put them aside at least for the time being. The mind will be a lot stronger if you can. You'll also end that there are areas within you where you're creating a lot of unnecessary suffering. That suffering is weighing you down. When you're weighed down, you're less able to deal with your responsibilities. So putting the issues of the world aside is not an irresponsible act. That's one of your RST agendas. It's written into the basic refrain for right mindfulness. Subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. All the issues you have about what you want in the world or how you're upset about the world, you just want to put those aside. If they come up in the mind, you put them aside. I've been reading different books on mindfulness, and one of the strangest things I've found was in one book where the author said that the Buddha tells you never to interfere with anything that's happening in the mind. But that right there connects with the basic formula. Putting aside greed and distress, or subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. That part of the formula means that you've got to put aside anything that gets in the way of your seeing things simply in terms of the Four Noble Truths. That takes a lot of effort. Sometimes the effort requires a lot of ingenuity on your part, sometimes it's just a matter of watching things, allowing them to subside on their own. This varies from case to case. But even just watching things has an agenda. You're doing it because you want to understand them, or you found that that's the most effective way of dealing with that particular problem, that particular distraction, at that particular time. We deal with these things because we're here to figure out why we're creating unnecessary suffering and what we can do about it. Part of what we can do about it, of course, is to develop the path. This is where we're working specifically on the factors of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. They all go together. And they have to be informed by right view. So those are the factors we've got to get going. Right view itself has an agenda. You want to comprehend suffering so that you can put an end to it. How does that relate to the breath? Because right view tells you that if you want to put an end to suffering, you need to develop right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, and you're using the breath as a focal point for all three of these factors. How are you going to get the mind to stay settle down with the breath? That's the effort right now. As for right mindfulness, you keep the breath in mind. And regardless of whatever else comes up, you try to relate it to the breath. Feelings come up and you relate them to the breath. How does this feeling of pleasure or pain relate to the breath? Is it caused by the way I'm breathing? Or is it completely irrelevant? Say that there's a pain someplace in the body. How does that relate to the breath? Experiment a little bit to ND out. Change the way you breathe and see if that changes the pain. Breathe around the pain, breathe through the pain, from the top, the bottom, from the left to right. Change the way you think about the pain and see what that does to the way you breathe in reference to the pain. There are lots of ways to experiment. If nothing seems to work, then you just allow the pain to be there, while you work with other issues in the body. Try to create a sense of well-being someplace else. This then shades into right concentration. The Buddha says that as soon as you get sensitive to what long breathing feels like and what short breathing feels like, you try to expand your awareness to the whole body. Then you look out for what he calls bodily fabrication. This is the intentional element that goes into the in and out breath. He says to calm it down. How do you calm it? You're trying to make things more comfortable so that the breath feels less laborious and the body feels at ease. You change the rhythm of the way you breathe. You can make it deeper, more shallow, heavier, lighter, faster, slower. You can think of breathing in different parts of the body. If you notice that one set of muscles seems to be doing all the work, give those muscles a holiday. Say, okay, for the next few minutes you don't have to do any breathing work at all. And see how the rest of the body responds. Other parts of the body, other muscles will pitch in. They'll do the breathing work for a bit. You can also change the way you think about the breath, the mental labels with which you perceive it. Sometimes when we think about getting the breath energy to spread through the body, we're trying to push it through other sensations that are already there in the body. And sometimes that creates pressure, friction, a sense of discomfort. So change the perception. Try to think of the in and out breath just simply ling up the sensations of the body that are there, without having to run through them. Or think of it slipping through the spaces between the other sensations without pressing on them. It simply sousses through the body, with a minimum amount of friction, a minimum amount of pushing or pulling. See how that perception changes your sensation of the breath, and the extent to which your sense of the body is being fabricated by the way you breathe. There are lots of things to play with here, lots of things to adjust, lots of questions you can ask yourself around the breath. When the mind has trouble settling down, is it because of the way you breathe? Or is it because of the way you perceive the breath? If you perceive the breath as a more subtle energy sousing the body, then think of all the breath channels in the body being connected out to every pore. Just hold that perception in mind and see how the body responds. If you ND a sensation that feels really good, what can you do to maintain it? You can't clamp down on it, because that'll spoil it. It's like seeing a beautiful bubble and wanting to catch it, but of course, the act of catching it destroys the bubble. But suppose that the only thing that's going to cause the bubble to break is the wind. In that case, you can cup your hands around it and protect it. It's similar with really comfortable sensations in the body, especially ones that come from changing the way you breathe. How do you cup your mind and other sensations around them? How can you maintain that perception? How can you maintain that lightness of touch? As Ajahn Fuang once said, there are basically 3 stages to the meditation. One is learning how to do it. The second, once you've done it, is how to maintain it. You don't want to just have one little ash of quiet. You want the quiet to stay. So once it's there, how do you relax around it so that it stays without your trying to grab hold of it? Remember, grabbing hold is not the way things like this are maintained. There was once a woman in Thailand who was meditating in the Chiti on the hill at Wat Dhammasathat, and I happened to be watching her meditate. All of a sudden, she reached out as if she were trying to grab something in front of her, fell over, and then looked around to see if anybody was watching. She looked very embarrassed. Later she told me, sheepishly, that she'd had a vision of a golden tray floating in front of her, and her instinct was to grab it. Of course, that destroyed the vision. So when you ND something that's really nice, how do you maintain it? How do you relax around it? How do you give it space? How do you protect it without bursting the bubble? That's an important skill right there. If your concentration has gotten to the level where it's solid, then you're ready for Ajahn Fuang's third stage. Putting your concentration to use. You can ask yourself, what do I need clarity? Follow Ajahn Lee's example. You pose the question in your mind. Then you drop it and get into concentration to see if the stillness of the mind will yield an answer. If the issue is related specifically to what you're doing right here, right now, you approach it differently. Experiment with your breath, your perceptions, and look at what happens as a result. If nothing seems to be happening and you can't gure anything out, just sit and watch for a bit. See what you can observe, see if you can notice anything unexpected in the body or the mind. So sometimes the meditation involves experimenting, changing this and changing that to see what else gets changed. Sometimes the experiment is just sitting and watching. But either way, there's a purpose. And whether you make a formal vow about trying to gure something out in the course of the meditation, or simply pose a question in your mind and start poking around and exploring, always remember that there is a purpose for being here. We're trying to comprehend Zuering to the point where we can abandon its cause. The way we do that is by developing the factors of the path. That's the framework that gives meaning to everything we're doing. So always try to keep that larger framework in mind. As for anything that gets in the way or obscures that, remember the Buddha's instructions. You try to subdue it. And that's how you keep on track. The Wisdom of Ardency. July 2, 2012. All of the factors of the path build on right view, which means that they all contain an element of discernment or wisdom. The question sometimes arises, where in the practice of right mindfulness is the element of wisdom? There's a general tendency to see it in the quality of sampahana, or alertness. But alertness just notices what's happening. When things are there, it knows they're there. When they're not there, it knows that they're not there. This can serve as a basis for discernment, but it's not discernment in and of itself. Ajahn Lee was right, I think, in identifying ardency as the discernment element in mindfulness practice. Ardency is denoted in the texts as the feeling you have when you realize that there are unskillful mental states in your mind, and they're dangerous, that if you don't get rid of them, there's going to be danger. If you don't give rise to skillful states, there's going to be danger. This quality is very closely related to heedfulness. And the Pali term for ardency, atapa, is very closely related to atapa, which is the fear of evil, a sense of compunction, a sense of conscience. The realization that you can't be lazy or apathetic, just watching things arise and pass away. With ardency and compunction, you know that you're causing stress with your actions, and that the wise reaction, of course, is to try to stop the kinds of actions that would cause stress and Zuering. This is why it's wise. And it corresponds to something I felt for a long time. You sometimes see scholars of Buddhism who give the impression that they know better than everybody else. Those poor stupid people who are practicing aren't as wise as the scholars. That's what the scholars think, but the scholars just sit there and read the books and talk about what they've read. The wise people are the ones who realize they've got unskillful qualities in their minds, that those qualities are causing Zuering, and that they've got to do something about it. The best use of the Dhamma is not to talk about it, but to use it to get rid of that Zuering. It's in guring out what you've got to do to act more skillfully. That's where the wisdom lies. That's where the discernment lies. So you need to develop a sense of how important your actions are. Wisdom is something that has to lead to action. There is wisdom in the action, or you could say that the practice here is wisdom in action. The willingness to look at the events coming up in the mind, and to step back from them just enough to notice, where do these things lead? Are they skillful, or are they unskillful? That's where wisdom can begin. Ardency, of course, is very closely related to the factor that comes before right mindfulness, which is right-eared. Right-eared builds on right view in the sense that it makes the distinctions between skillful actions and unskillful actions, skillful qualities of mind and unskillful qualities of mind, and then it tries to do something about them. You have the duties of the Four Noble Truths. You try to comprehend stress, abandon the cause, realize the cessation of stress, and develop the path to the cessation of stress. The various duties of right eart, which are closely related to ardency, follow from that, such as the abandoning of the second noble truth. That comes under trying to prevent unskillful qualities from arising and to abandon the ones that have arisen. Then there's the developing of the path, the fourth noble truth, which corresponds to trying to give rise to skillful qualities that haven't yet arisen, and then to develop them further when they have arisen. As you try to bring that development to its culmination, you have to comprehend the RST noble truth, so that nally you can realize the third. All of this has to be driven by desire. The element of discernment relates very closely to desire. What kinds of things do you really desire in life? How do you want your life to play out? What you desire in life is very important. And the realization that it's important is an essential part of wisdom. All too often we hear that we shouldn't desire anything, that we should learn how to just stop wanting. But for what purpose does not wanting serve? There's a desire hidden in there. As Ajahn Mahabua points out, the only people who have no wants at all are those who are dead. Even arahants have preferences. They would prefer to see people reach the end of suffering just like themselves. They would prefer to see people not harm one another. Of course, their happiness doesn't depend on it. That's why they're free. But the fact that they're free doesn't mean that they lack compassion or discernment or powers of judgment. What this means, of course, is that we have to look at our lives in the light of the Four Noble Truths along with their duties, and realize there's work to be done. A common recommendation among the forest ajahns is that you think about the time when you're going to die and ask yourself what kind of life you would like to look back on. If you looked back on your life and realized, I wasted all that time that I could have devoted to being on the path was just thrown away. Instead of abandoning the causes of stress, I was developing them, and instead of developing the path I was abandoning it, there'd be a lot of regret if that was the kind of life you had to look back on. The kind of life you want to look back on is the one that, whether or not you had come to the end of suffering and stress, you could say, at least I put in my best effort. I tried with all my ingenuity, all my discernment, all my energy. My time wasn't wasted. Wisdom begins with the reaction on death. The fact that your life is going to end, that many things will just disappear with the end of life, but some things will not disappear. There will be a continuity, and you want to make sure that the continuity will be good. To make sure of that, you want to make sure that your continuity is good right now. What are you doing? As the Buddha has you ask yourself, what am I becoming as days and nights wipe past? What sort of person are you becoming? Are you becoming an ardent person? Or are you becoming a lazy, complacent person? The wisdom lies in the ardency, the realization that there are dangers out there and in here. As I said, this is related to heedfulness and the realization that you can also do something about it. Then you try to figure out how you can do it, because there are members in the committee who say, well, I'd much rather relax right now, or take things easy, or I need my rewards of pleasure. I can practice tomorrow. How are you going to deal with them? That, too, is an element of wisdom. Knowing that there are things that you like to do, but they're going to cause harm down the line. The wisdom lies in knowing how to talk yourself out of them. There are things you don't like to do but are going to give rise to good results down the line. How do you talk yourself into doing them? That, the Buddha said, is a measure of your discernment. So the discernment is all in the action. It's not in reading the books, or observing other people, or in coming up with alternative ways to spend your time. You hear about more and more people getting involved in what they call engaged Buddhism. They're looking down on people who meditate, saying that meditators are selfish. Well, that's not the Dhamma speaking. That's people's dilemma speaking. The best thing you can do for the world is to learn how to engage with your dilemmas in a way that puts an end to them. That's where your Buddhism should be engaged. Because otherwise your dilemmas just keep burning you, and for you they burn other people. There's wisdom in realizing that, and wisdom in following through with that realization. realizing you've really got to do something about your mind. The ardency with which you set out on that task is the measure of how wise and discerning you're becoming. Feelings not of the flesh. August 23, 2012. When the Buddha talks about focusing on feelings as a frame of reference, he talks about two main kinds. What he calls feelings of the esh and feelings not of the esh. The distinction doesn't have to do with the difference between physical and mental feelings. Feelings of the esh can be physical or mental. Feelings not of the esh can be physical or mental. The difference lies in where they come from, the issues they're related to. Feelings of the esh refer to the sense of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain you feel when you meet either with things that you like, in terms of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations. Those would be pleasures, or with things you don't like in terms of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations. Those would be pains, or the times when you're on an even keel. Neither pleased nor displeased by the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations you encounter in the course of the day. These kinds of feelings can arise pretty willy-nilly depending on your mood, depending on your attitude, depending on the situation around you. They're the feelings you tend to encounter most often. As for feelings not of the esh, these have to do with the practice. And it's right here when you begin to realize that when the Buddha's talking about feelings, he's not talking about just whatever happens to come and go. Because feelings not of the esh have to be produced. You have to give rise to them. If you don't give rise to them, they don't happen. If you don't maintain them, they don't stay. Pain not of the esh, for instance, has to do with your desire to get the mind to be trained in concentration and to gain awakening. As the Buddha says, when you realize that you can't get the mind to stay equanimous in the face of negative things, you should regard it as an instance of bad fortune. This doesn't bode well for me, you should say to yourself. I can't bring my mind in line with the Buddha's teachings. The feeling that goes along with that thought is painful. It's not a physical feeling necessarily, but there is a mental pain that goes along with it. Why can't I get my mind to settle down? The Buddha actually encourages that kind of thinking. All too often we hear that you shouldn't exert yourself too hard in the meditation, or don't set up any goals for yourself. Those are the kinds of instructions that can be appropriate for a weekend retreat when people tend to put themselves in a pressure cooker, thinking about the fact that they could have gone down to the beach instead for the weekend, but here they are on a meditation retreat. So they want something to show for it. Stream entry at least. Of course. When you're in that frame of mind, you place impossible demands on yourself and make yourself miserable. So in cases like that, you should be encouraged to drop any idea of goals and just be with the present. But when you're thinking of the practice as a lifetime endeavor, you've got to have goals, and you've got to have a sense of where you want to go. And one way of motivating yourself is to remind yourself that you do want to get to the goal. Even though it's painful to realize you're not there yet, there's no way you'll work toward the goal without fostering that kind of pain and then acting on it. Another way of inducing pains not of the esh is to ask, when will I reach the awakening that those other noble ones have reached? That's an instance of pain that's actually inspiring. But you don't stop there. You use it as a motivation to develop pleasure not of the esh, which the Buddha ranks on two levels. The RST level is the level of pleasure that comes with the strong states of concentration, when the mind gets settled in with the breath. There's a sense of ease that comes with that, both physical and mental, sometimes even a sense of rapture, fullness, a very cool sense of well-being. This is something you have to work to give rise to. It doesn't just come willy-nilly. Moments of that kind of pleasure may happen randomly now and then, but as long as they're still just random, they can't serve as the path. You want to lock into them the same way a plane locks into a radar beam when it's going to land in an airport. You lock in with the breath and just stay right on target. There's a sense of pleasure and solidity that comes with that, and the Buddha advises that you settle in and indulge in that sense of pleasure. Another thing you hear all too often is that you shouldn't let yourself get attached to concentration practice or attached to the pleasure of concentration. but actually that pleasure is something you should get attached to, again as motivation to develop it further. Eventually you can wean yourself away from that attachment, but in the beginning you need that kind of attachment to pry yourself away from attachments that are less skillful. You have to get skilled at giving rise to it so that you have something better to hold on to than the old run-of-the-mill sensual pleasures that rule your life otherwise. Right here is where you can see how pleasures and pains not of the esh are not things you simply watch as they come or go willy-nilly. You give rise to them when necessary, because you've got to maintain this kind of pain to motivate yourself to give rise to this kind of pleasure. As with all skillful states, if they're not there, you try to give rise to them. When they are there, you try to develop them. Ultimately, you want to develop them to a level the Buddha calls pleasure more not of the esh than not of the esh. That's the pleasure that comes when you react on the fact that you've attained awakening. In other words, you've reached the goal, or at the very least, you've had your RST genuine taste of the goal. Similarly with equanimity. Equanimity not of the esh is the equanimity that comes with the fourth jhana, and then develops up through the higher formless states. This, too, is something you've got to induce. You don't just sit there and wait for it to hit you upside the head. You get the mind to settle in with the breath, and this breath gets more and more renet as the energy in the body gets more and more connected, to the point where the in and out breathing stops not because you sigh at it, but because it's no longer needed. Sometimes when things settle in, everything seems automatic and simply connects, and the breath stops on its own. But if it doesn't, there are things you can work with to get the breath headed in that direction. Think of all the energy channels in the body connecting up with one another, so that they nourish one another. If one part of the body has a little bit of excess energy, you allow it to feed other parts of the body that seem to be lacking in energy. When all these multiple connections inside get opened up to the pores of the skin, so that the energy source is everywhere in the body, that's when you can let the in and out breath grow more and more calm, because you don't really need it that much. You ultimately get to the point where you don't need it at all. This is where the mind gets solid and really still. That's equanimity not of the esh. And again, it has to be induced. As for the second level of equanimity more not of the esh than not of the esh, that refers to the equanimity you feel after you've attained awakening. You react on the fact that your mind is now free from delemment. And there's a sense of great peace. It's only on that level, the level more not of the esh than not of the esh, that pleasure and equanimity don't have to be induced. But on the way there, feelings of pleasure and equanimity not of the esh have to be induced and maintained as best you can. But this ties in with everything else the Buddha says on mindfulness. When he talks about mindfulness as a governing principle, this is what he means. If anything unskillful arises in the mind, the duty of mindfulness is to try to figure out how to get rid of it. When something skillful has developed, you try to remember to keep it going and nurture it, so that it develops further. That's how mindfulness governs the other factors of the path. In other words, it looks at what's there in the mind, and it remembers, from what you've done or heard in the past, what to do with that particular state of mind. If the mind doesn't want to settle down, what have you learned about dealing with an obstreperous mind? Either from what you've heard, or what you've read, or what you've done on your own in your practice. When things are going well, how do you remember to keep them well balanced? That's a much more delicate proposition, because if you think too much about keeping things balanced, they begin to get wobbly. But you can survey the situation when things seem to be going well, and you try to develop a sense of how you can maintain them, to keep them going. Remember that this is what you want to do when things are going well. You remember to keep them going. And try to detect any ways that you can make the concentration more solid, the sense of well-being more subtle. It's not just a matter of simply being with whatever happens to arise or whatever happens to pass away. There are certain things, skillful states of mind, that you want to make arise, and you want to prevent them from passing away. As for unskillful states of mind, you want to remember to try to prevent them from arising. If they are there, you try to remember how to get them to pass away as quickly as you can. That's mindfulness as a governing principle. And when the Buddha lists feelings not of the esh under feelings as a frame of reference, that's just an illustration of this very point, because these things don't just come or just go, and you're not here just to watch them come or go. You're here to induce them and to keep them going, to maintain them so that they develop and grow, so that ultimately you can free yourself from pains not of the esh, and experience nothing but the pleasure and equanimity not of the esh. So remember that that's where we're headed. Bodies and minds outside. October 21, 2013. When describing the various ways of developing or establishing mindfulness, the Buddha talks about being focused on the body in and of itself, internally, externally, or both. And the same with feelings, mind, and mental qualities. You can focus on them either internally, externally, or both. Internally, it's pretty obvious what he's talking about. Your own experience of body, feelings, and so forth. But what about externally? If you believe that mindfulness means simply being aware, how are you going to watch other people's feelings or mind states? Actually, though, mindfulness means keeping something in mind. And that means that you keep in mind that other people are experiencing their bodies, feelings, and mind states as well. This then becomes a very useful instruction in that it reminds you to compare what you've got with what other people have, and there are lots of different ways you can benefit from this kind of contemplation. For instance, with the body. You react that your body is made out of the 4 properties. And it's the same with other people's bodies. I remember when I was young, I used to think I had a special relationship to my body. We were on good terms. I took care of it and I thought it would be nice to me in return. But as you get older, you realize that your body is there not because it wants to be, or because it's happy to be there. After all, it's just made out of the food you ate. You took it over. When it's going to do its body thing, it's just going to do its body thing. No matter how well you care for it, no matter how wonderful the food or how good your exercise program, your body is going to age. It's going to grow ill and it's going to die, just like everyone else's. This helps give you a realistic check on your relationship to your body, or what you can expect out of it. But it also helps to react that if you think about where you'd like to be reborn, there's going to be another body. And it's going to have the same problems that this one does. No matter how good things get, say, you decide you want to be a bodhisattva, you have to come back and be born again and again and again, and you have to eat again and again, and you have to eat clothing and shelter, all of which places a huge burden on other people and other beings. So it gets you thinking. Maybe the best thing would be to go to a formless realm. Okay, but in the formless realms, if you get there, it's very difficult to do any kind of contemplation. So you've got to come back to the form realm again, and to the problems of having a body again. The best thing is to get out. So this kind of reaction is both a good equalizer and a good inducement to samvega. As for your body image, it's good to equalize that, too. Try that reaction on the 32 parts of the body to think of what you've got. The Buddha always advises that you start with your own body RST, and then think about other people's bodies. The same 32 parts, and more. The 32 parts are just for starters. You can ask yourself, which one of those parts would you like to put up here on the altar? Which one would you like to see on a plate? Which one, if it's liquid, would you like to bathe in? Well, none of them. Everybody else's is the same. If you have an especially high regard for how you look, think about what's inside. If you have a low regard for how you look, and we have a lot of that in our culture because of the unrealistic body images that we see in the media, it's good to realize that with all those beautiful bodies, all you have to do is just take away the skin, and you wouldn't be able to look at them. So this reaction is a good equalizer. I was talking to some Dhamma magazine editors the other day, and mentioning that if you have a low body image or negative body image, this kind of analysis can actually be really good for you in that it reminds you that everybody else has just the same parts you have. Those editors had never heard the idea before, which tells you a lot about American Dhamma. So reaction on bodies inside and out is meant to be an equalizer, and to give you a sense of samvega. Not to say that the body is bad, just that it's not the sort of thing you want if you're looking for something beautiful. However, it is something to look for if you want a tool to practice with. After all, when you're sitting in meditation, what's doing the sitting? The body. When you focus on the breath, you're focusing on the body. When you practice jhana, you allow the body with pleasure and rapture, so that you can settle down comfortably in it. When you do walking meditation, you've got to use your body. To listen to the Dhamma, you need the ears. So you realize that the best use for this body is to practice the Dhamma. If you ever aspire to another lifetime, you want a body that's able to practice the Dhamma. But to keep these priorities clear, you have to strip away any idea that the body's worth lies in looking good. Realize that that's a major distraction, and contemplate hard to counteract any tendencies in the mind that tell you otherwise. Otherwise, they'll sneak in and take over. That's the body. As for feelings, you react on the fact that you have feelings of pleasure, pain, and neither pleasure nor pain. You love pleasure and you hate pain. Then you react on the fact that other people have the same pleasures and pains. Here again, the reaction acts as an equalizer and as a spur to samvega. On the one hand, it helps to equalize your sense of compassion and goodwill. You realize that if your happiness depends on other people's suffering, they're not going to stand for it. You can't say, "Excuse me, this is my happiness, and so you'll just have to let me continue enjoying it because it's so special." They'll say, "This is my suffering. It's special, too. I don't want it." This is an equalizer in that it makes you realize that your happiness forces you to take other people's happiness into account. But the same reaction can be used to induce samvega. You realize that wherever you're going to be reborn, there's going to be pleasure, there's going to be pain. There are heavens where it's exclusively pleasant, but then when you leave those heavens, you come back down to pain. And sometimes it's really hard. The higher you go, the harder you fall. I've told you about some of Ajahn Fuang's students who were extremely Dai-cult people. Nothing was ever good enough for them. And his comment was that they were divas in their previous lifetimes. They still hadn't adjusted to the fact that they were human beings again. Being a diva and having all that pleasure is no guarantee that it's going last forever. Sometimes it makes it harder to come back. So again, you can take this reaction as motivation to practice really seriously, to see if you can go beyond that. As for mind states, they entail the same sort of reaction. On the one hand, it's an equalizer. Whatever you're experiencing in your mind, other people are experiencing the same sorts of things. And what they're experiencing, you've experienced before. This can help with compassion and empathetic joy. There's that passage where the Buddha talks about seeing people who are extremely wealthy and realizing you've been there before. When you see people who are extremely poor or ill, you've been there before as well. This helps to equalize things to counteract resentment or pride. But this reaction can equalize things in another way. You can think about people who are faced with the same mental problems that you have. The mind when it's depressed, the mind when it's scattered. All the great meditators of the past and the present have had just exactly the same kinds of problem. Yet they were able to get past them. In the same way, when you're sitting with pain, realize that other people have sat with pain, too, and yet they were able to keep sitting with it. What did they have that you don't have? They had persistence. Where did they get that? It wasn't that they were born with it. They developed it. You can develop it, too. This way, the reaction on other people's minds can lift you up. When you hear about people sitting long hours of meditation, you say, "Why can't I try that, too?" When you run into pain, you have to realize they ran into the same pain. What did they do? They must have done something. The fact that someone has set an example like this opens your mind to possibilities that you wouldn't have thought of before. As the Buddha said, without him as our admirable friend, we wouldn't have thought of the path. But the fact that he's there as an example, and the noble disciples are there as examples, opens our minds to the possibility that maybe we can follow the path as well. This kind of equalizing helps to inspire you to greater heights. Reaction on other people's mind states is also a good reaction for fairness. When you see other people acting on their unskillful mind states, it gives you a chance to see what you look like when you act on yours. It's not a pretty sight. For example, we all have a tendency to want to straighten other people out. We want this person to be that way and that person to be this way. But when other people try to straighten you out, how do you feel? The Thais call this putting other people's heart in your heart and your heart in theirs. In other words, realizing that what you feel is what other people feel. If you ever want to straighten anything out, well, you've got your heart here that needs straightening out RST. And so focus right here because this is where you really can do the work. This is where all this reaction on bodies and feelings and mind states outside has to come back to what you're doing with your body, your feelings, and your mind states. These are the things you're responsible for. But by casting your thoughts out in that wide net for a while, you get some perspective on what you're doing right here. If you do it skillfully, it can really be an aid in the practice. So don't neglect this part of the meditation, because it really can help your motivation, it can help you develop the right attitudes, and help you think of possibilities you may not have thought of before. Strengthening concentration. January 5, 2012. In English, when we talk about somebody being single-minded, the implication is that the person is very focused on one single purpose or one single aim. It's a quality of the will. And that's a very relevant way of thinking about concentration. It's not only that you should have a single object on which you're focused at the moment, but your purpose should be single as well. You're going to stay right here and not let anything else distract you. This means that concentration is a quality both of awareness and of the will. To strengthen it, you have to think about the qualities that strengthen your will. And it turns out that they're the same as the qualities that strengthen your mindfulness. The RST quality is virtue. You observe the precepts as practice in making promises to yourself that you then try to keep. You promise yourself that you're not going to kill anything, not even a little insects. Not even termites. No stealing, no illicit sex, no lying, no taking of intoxicants. You set these principles up as promises and then try to keep to them. You learn things about yourself in the process. One is that you learn the areas where you have difficulty. And two, you've got to learn how to negotiate with your connecting intentions. This is where the second quality comes in, which is having right view. Realizing why this is important, why you want to be doing this. All too often, we think of developing our willpower simply as kind of a brute force. But the force of willpower can last only for so long on its own. It needs help. The main way you can help it is through adjusting your understanding. For instance, with the precepts, you begin to see that life actually does get better, things get a lot easier, when you're holding to the precepts. Once you really perceive that you're making things easier for yourself, it changes the equation. The precepts are not such a battle. What you've done is that you've changed your perception, changed your understanding, in a way that enables you to strategize more effectively in overcoming resistance in the mind. The same thing applies with concentration. The Buddha talks about times when you're trying to focus on the breath, and the mind says, "Oh, I'm not willing to settle down." He calls it having a fever in the body or a fever in the mind, an unwillingness to stay settled. He doesn't recommend just bulldozing through it. Instead, he says to switch over to something inspiring. This is where an important adjunct to focusing on the breath, focusing on the body, is the set of standard recollections, because they help you get your views straightened out. And they help strengthen your motivation for why you're here. Ajahn Lee talks about how important it is to develop a sense of samvega if you're going to get the mind really settled down. You can contemplate the parts of the body, and that's not necessarily just for the issue of lust. It's for whatever the form of your attachment to this physical lump here. Pride, possessiveness, shame, whatever. If you really look into the body, what do you actually have there? All kinds of things you wouldn't want to associate with. If your stomach was sitting on a chair next to you at the dinner table, you wouldn't want to have a conversation. You'd be grossed out. Your lungs and all the other parts. They're not the kind of thing that you would like to socialize with, and yet so much of our life, so much of our energy is devoted to keeping the body healthy, keeping it comfortable, and those are just the reasonable things we do with the body. On top of that, there are other things. We get totally obsessed with its looks, totally obsessed with how we're going to keep it as young and attractive as possible. When you can learn how to see the futility of the whole thing, you develop a sense of samvega, a sense of dismay. And it's very chastening. Sometimes that sense of being chastened is enough to bring the mind squarely into the present moment. You look at the various activities in life, and they begin to seem very futile. You begin to see the importance of getting the mind trained so that it doesn't have to depend on the body, doesn't have to depend on things outside for its happiness. You begin to see that the discovery of the Dhamma, the discovery of something that really is deathless inside, is something of genuine worth. It's your only hope for any kind of genuine happiness. Learn how to motivate yourself in this way, or in whatever way that works. After all, this is something that's really very individual. Sometimes you read the Dhirant Ajahns talking about the kind of contemplation that brought their minds down to concentration, and it just seems to roll over your back. It's not that grabbing, not that compelling. You have to look into your own mind to see what is compelling in your case. How do you actually motivate yourself? Sometimes it's through contemplation of death. Sometimes it's when you think of something more positively inspiring, like the Buddha, the Dhamma, or the Sangha. There are a whole host of other ways of developing strategies for motivating yourself. I've been reading recently about how famous writers motivated themselves to write. Anthony Trollope, for example, made a vow to himself that he would write X number of words every day. And he wouldn't leave his writing room until he had niched that amount. That meant, of course, that on some days he was writing garbage. But at least he was churning out a certain amount, and he got it so that, after a while, it wasn't garbage. Raymond Chandler had a Dhirant approach. He would give himself 4 hours every day to write. And if he wasn't writing, he wouldn't do anything else. He would just sit there doing nothing. And pretty soon the boredom would bring up something. He had found that if he allowed himself to read or putter around during the 4 hours, then nothing would come. But if the choice was simply nothing or writing, pretty soon he was writing. So Dhirant people have Dhirant techniques, Dhirant approaches for getting themselves going. And a large part of learning how to understand yourself and how to deal with your dilemmas lies in figuring out what approach works for you, what strategies get you more motivated to practice. You might try Trollope's approach and just put in the hours on the cushion or the meditation track every day, without demanding that they have to be good hours all the time. Or you can apply Chandler's approach and put yourself in an empty room with nothing else to do but meditate, to see if the boredom gets you back on the cushion. As the Buddha said, one of the measures of your wisdom and discernment is how you talk yourself out of doing things that you like to do, but get bad results, and how you talk yourself into doing things you don't like to do, but do give good results. That's one of the main measures of your wisdom. We tend to think of wisdom as something that comes at the very end of the practice. Those short, pointed statements that come one per page, with wide margins, in books about wisdom. But to really develop wisdom, you have to develop a pragmatic approach to how you're going to get things to work in the mind, and how you're going to get yourself motivated. This is why so many of the Thai Ajahns were people of few words, but their words were sharp and pointed. They had honed things down to what works. What ways of thinking work? What ways of motivating themselves work? You go right for the jugular immediately, then you get down to work. That's an important part of wisdom and discernment. And it's something we all have to develop. Learning the nuts and bolts of how to psyche ourselves out, to see which way of thinking, which application of right view, is going to really hit the mind, so that it's motivated to practice. This is an extremely important part of the practice. We can learn about the steps and all the Dhirant techniques in dealing with the breath, getting the mind to settle down with the breath, making the breath comfortable, and that's one of the important strategies right there. How you conceive of the breath, thinking of the breath as energy throughout the body. That's one set of skills and strategies that help you to associate sitting in meditation with a sense of well-being, a sense of refreshment. And you have that to tap into when mind gets antsy and wants a quick X of pleasure. But there are lots of other issues that are going on in the mind as well, in terms of your motivation, of why you're here, why you're doing this. It's good to think about these issues, to be clear about them. Wisdom doesn't come from simply turning over the thinking in the mind and trying to observe, without any comment at all. That teaches you some lessons, but a lot of lessons never get learned that way. Insight practice is also a matter of exploration, experimentation, trying to gure things out. Why is it that greed, aversion, and delusion can still have power over the mind, even when you've learned so much about their drawbacks? What's still their gratification? What can you do to wean yourself over that? Can you teach yourself new ways of feeding? This is up to your own ingenuity. But that's how you strengthen your concentration. You come to stillness of mind by learning how to think about how important stillness of mind is, and how much you want it. Without that sense of motivation, the single-mindedness of your concentration doesn't stay single for long. So if you find that your concentration is weak, look carefully at the actual topic you're focused on. You can adjust the breath, work with the breath. If that's not working, then look at the two factors that strengthen your mindfulness and willpower. 1. Look at your precepts and ask yourself, what's wrong with your precepts? What can you do to stick with them more actively? And then, 2. Look at your motivation. Why are you doing this? How do you deal with the direct committee members in the mind that are pulling you away? As you experiment with these direct approaches, you'll find the ones that work, so that your single-mindedness really stays single. It really does develop power. Without the strength of the concentration, your discernment won't be strong enough to deal with the dilemmas. The two of them have to work together. Your discernment strengthens your concentration strengthens your discernment. Abhasaka keys images of washing your hands. Your left hand has to wash your right, and your right hand washes your left. That's how they both get clean. In harmony with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the immense importance of sharing wisdom expansively. Presently, we've transformed this extensive 1,000-page work into a readily accessible audio format. The duty to advance this noble cause now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, benefiting numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of knowledge sharing and the cultivation of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We extend an invitation for you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can bring profound positive change to the lives of many.